The gunfire echoed across the Belgian forest like thunder that refused to end, cutting through December frost as smoke from burning vehicles hung in the air like funeral shrouds. December 17th, 1944. Somewhere between the chaos of Hitler's last desperate offensive and a future nobody could predict, Dr. Klaus Brenner crouched in a bombed-out farmhouse, treating wounds he couldn't fully heal with supplies he didn't have. When the shelling finally stopped at dawn, the silence felt worse than the noise. It meant someone had won, someone had lost. And the wounded men scattered across the snow-covered field, British and German both, didn't care which was which anymore. They just wanted to stop bleeding. Klaus looked up from the British soldier, whose leg he'd been trying to save, and saw them. American troops, advancing through the tree line, rifles ready, eyes scanning for targets. And in that moment, as the American sergeant's gaze locked onto the Wehrmacht medical insignia on Klaus's torn jacket, Dr. Klaus Brenner understood something that made his hands go still. He could save enemy soldiers all day, but nobody could save him from being the enemy. Then the sergeant said it, his voice carrying across the frozen field like a judge reading a sentence. "Hands up, Kraut. You're done." Before we go deeper into this impossible true story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from around the world. These stories of humanity trapped inside war need to be remembered, and you're part of keeping them alive. Dr. Klaus Brenner, 34 years old, a physician's son from a village outside Hamburg, where the only war he'd wanted to fight was against disease, raised his blood-covered hands slowly. Behind him, 3 British soldiers lay on improvised stretchers, alive because Klaus had spent the night doing battlefield surgery with a penknife and thread from a parachute. In front of him, American soldiers who had every right to shoot first and ask questions never. Somewhere between those two groups, Klaus existed in a space the war hadn't created rules for. A German medic who'd violated orders by treating enemy wounded, who'd stayed behind when his unit retreated, who'd chosen the Hippocratic Oath over military law and was about to pay for it in ways he couldn't imagine. "I am doctor," Klaus said in English he'd learned from medical textbooks that used British spelling. "These men, they need hospital. They die without help." The American sergeant, maybe 30, with a face carved by too many firefights and eyes that had stopped being surprised by anything, walked closer. His rifle never wavered. "You're Wehrmacht," he said flatly. "That makes you a prisoner." "Yes," Klaus agreed. "But first, I am doctor. Please, they need help now." The sergeant looked past Klaus at the British soldiers, at the bandages that had clearly been applied by someone who knew what they were doing, at the tourniquets that had saved limbs, at the evidence that this German medic had spent the night saving the lives of men his country was trying to kill. Something shifted in the sergeant's face. Not trust, not forgiveness, but recognition of something more complicated than enemy and ally. "Jackson!" the sergeant called. "Get a medic up here. We got wounded Brits." Then he looked back at Klaus. "You move, you die. Understand?" "Yes," Klaus said. "I understand." But he didn't move to run. He moved back to the British soldier whose leg was still bleeding, whose pulse was getting weaker, whose chance of survival dropped with every second that passed. The American sergeant's rifle tracked him. "I said don't move." "He dies if I stop," Klaus said simply, his hands already working, applying pressure, checking for arterial damage. "You can shoot me after, but not before I finish." And in that moment, Sergeant William Hayes, US Army, 101st Airborne, veteran of Normandy and Market Garden, and more firefights than he could count, made a decision that violated every protocol in the book. "5 minutes," he said. "Then you're done whether he is or not." Klaus worked faster than he'd ever worked in his life, tied off the bleeder, stabilized the leg, gave the British soldier, a corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, a shot of morphine Klaus had been saving for German casualties. 3 minutes. The American medics arrived, took one look at Klaus's work, and nodded with professional respect that transcended uniforms. 4 minutes. Klaus stood, hands up again, and let the Americans bind his wrists with wire that cut into his skin. 5 minutes. The British corporal opened his eyes, looked at Klaus through a morphine haze, and said in a voice barely louder than breathing, "Thank you, mate. Thank you." Klaus nodded once. Then Sergeant Hayes grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the wounded, away from the farmhouse, away from the only purpose Klaus had found in this entire nightmare war. "You're coming with us," Hayes said. "POW processing. Then a camp, if you're lucky." "And if I am not lucky?" Klaus asked. Hayes didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the answer. German soldiers who violated orders, who treated enemy casualties, who stayed behind to help the opposition, were traitors. And traitors didn't get lucky. They got courts-martial. They got firing squads. They got erased from the official record like they'd never existed. They marched Klaus back through the Belgian forest, past burned-out tanks and frozen bodies, and the debris of battle that looked the same whether the dead wore grey or khaki. Other American soldiers stared as they passed, some with hatred, some with curiosity. One young private, couldn't have been more than 19, spat at Klaus's feet and muttered, "Fucking Nazi." Klaus didn't correct him, didn't explain that he'd never joined the party, had been conscripted as a medic because Germany needed doctors more than it needed soldiers, had spent 4 years trying to save lives in a war designed to end them. What was the point? The uniform told the only story these men wanted to hear. By mid-morning, they reached a temporary American command post, a requisitioned schoolhouse that still had children's drawings on the walls. Sergeant Hayes pushed Klaus into a small office that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and handed him off to a captain who looked at Klaus the way a butcher looks at meat. "This the Kraut medic who was treating our boys?" Captain Morrison asked, his voice flat. "Yes, sir," Hayes confirmed. "He was working on 3 British soldiers when we found him, saved at least 2 of them, maybe all 3. Morrison studied Klaus for a long moment. "You speak English?" "Yes," Klaus said, "some." "Why'd you stay behind to treat enemy wounded?" It was the question Klaus had been asking himself all night, the question that had no answer that would satisfy military logic. But he tried anyway. "Because they were dying," he said simply. "Because I am doctor. Because Hippocratic Oath say first do no harm, not first check which flag they serve." Morrison's expression didn't change. "The Hippocratic Oath doesn't apply in war, Doctor. You know that." "Then war is wrong," Klaus said before he could stop himself. The office went silent. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Morrison's jaw tightened. "That kind of talk will get you shot," the captain said quietly. "By your side or ours, doesn't matter which." "I know," Klaus said. "But it is still true." Morrison stared at him, then did something Klaus didn't expect. He picked up a telephone, made a call, and said words that changed everything. "I need to speak to Major Stewart. Tell him I've got a German medic here who might be worth interrogating. No, not intelligence. Medical. Yeah, I'll hold." Klaus's German was good enough to understand the implication. Interrogation, not trial, not immediate execution. Interrogation meant someone thought he was valuable, meant someone wanted information, meant he might live long enough to regret staying behind. 3 days later, Klaus found himself in a different kind of prison. Not a POW camp, not a cell. A field hospital tent where wounded soldiers, British and American both, lay in rows that stretched further than Klaus could see. And Major Robert Stewart, US Army Medical Corps, stood in the centre of it all, looking at Klaus like a problem he couldn't quite solve. "Captain Morrison says you're a physician," Stewart said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been doing battlefield surgery for too long with too few hands. "Trained in Hamburg?" "Yes." "And you treated British casualties at your own risk?" "Yes." Stewart walked closer. He was older than Morrison, maybe 45. with grey at his temples and hands that trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. I have 300 wounded men in this hospital, 15 medical personnel. We're doing 6 amputations a day because we don't have enough surgeons to save limbs. Men are dying from infections we could prevent if we had enough doctors to change dressings every 4 hours instead of every 12. He paused. I need help. I don't care what uniform it comes from. Klaus felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. You want me to work here? Under guard, Stuart clarified. Under supervision. But yes, I want you to work here. Save Allied soldiers. Help me keep men alive who would otherwise die. And if I refuse, then you go to a POW camp and rot until the war ends. Maybe longer, depending on what your own people do to traitors who help the enemy. It wasn't really a choice. Klaus knew that. Stuart knew that. But something in the Major's voice suggested this wasn't just pragmatism. This was a test. A chance to prove that the Hippocratic Oath could survive the war. That humanity could exist inside uniforms. That a German doctor could save Allied soldiers not because he had to, but because saving lives was who he was. I will help, Klaus said. But I have condition. Stuart's eyebrows rose. You're not in a position to negotiate, Doctor. Not negotiate, Klaus corrected. Request. If I save your soldiers, when war ends, you help me find my family. My wife, Anna. My daughter, Sophie. In Hamburg. I have not heard from them in 8 months. I do not know if they are alive. Stuart was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. If you save my men, Doctor, I'll do everything in my power to find your family. You have my word. Then we have agreement, Klaus said. And just like that, Dr. Klaus Brenner, Wehrmacht medic, conscientious objector, man who'd violated every military protocol to save enemy lives, became the most controversial medical asset the US Army had ever acquired. The first day, the American soldiers refused to let him touch them. Klaus stood beside a surgical table, while a corporal with a shattered arm stared at his Wehrmacht jacket with hatred so pure it felt like a physical force. I'd rather die than let a Nazi touch me, the corporal said, his voice shaking with pain and rage. Klaus met his eyes. I am not Nazi, he said quietly. I am doctor who do not wish you to die. But if you prefer death to German medicine, I respect this choice. It is your arm, your life. Major Stuart stepped in. Corporal, this man saved 3 British soldiers 2 days ago. Stayed behind enemy lines to do it. I trust him with a scalpel. You should too. The corporal looked between them. Pain won. Fine, he spat. But if I die, it's on you. If you die, Klaus said, already examining the wound, it is because shrapnel destroy your brachial artery and infection is setting in your bone, not because I am German. Now be quiet so I can work. He saved the corporal's arm. It took 3 hours of microsurgery. Klaus wasn't even sure he could perform under field conditions. But he did it. Used techniques he'd learned from a Jewish professor in Hamburg, who'd fled to America in 1938, who'd taught Klaus that medicine had no borders, that the oath superseded politics, that saving lives was the only war worth fighting. When the corporal woke up and realized his arm was still attached, still functional, still his, he looked at Klaus with something that wasn't quite gratitude, but wasn't hatred anymore either. Why? The corporal asked. Why save me? Because you were bleeding, Klaus said simply. And I know how to stop bleeding is not more complicated than this. But it was more complicated. Everything about Klaus's situation was more complicated. He worked under armed guard, slept in a locked tent, ate after everyone else had eaten, with his hands watched constantly in case he tried to poison food or steal weapons or do any of the 1,000 things a German prisoner might do if given half a chance. But he also saved lives. 8 in the first week, 14 in the second. By the third week, American soldiers stopped refusing his treatment, started requesting him specifically for complex surgeries, started calling him Doc instead of the Kraut or the prisoner or any of the other names that reduced him to an enemy instead of a physician. And something strange happened. Klaus started to heal too, not from wounds, from the weight of 4 years spent patching up soldiers who'd be sent back to kill or be killed, from the guilt of working for an army he didn't believe in, fighting for a cause that had poisoned his country, from the isolation of being the only man in his unit who thought the oath mattered more than orders. Major Stewart noticed. "You're sleeping better," he observed one morning while they prepped for surgery. "Yes," Klaus admitted. "It's strange. I am prisoner. Should sleep worse, yes?" "You're doing what you were meant to do," Stewart said, "instead of what you were forced to do. Makes a difference." Klaus was quiet for a moment. Then, "In Hamburg, before war, I work in children's hospital. Pneumonia, broken bones, normal things doctors fix. I was happy. Then war come. They put me in Wehrmacht, send me to front. 4 years I patch soldiers so they can go back to fighting. 4 years I save men who will kill other men. Is not medicine. Is maintenance. Keeping machines running." "And now?" Stewart asked. "Now I save men so they can go home," Klaus said. "So they can live. Not fight, live. Is what doctors should do." Stewart nodded. "Then keep doing it, Klaus. For as long as this war lets you." But the war had other plans. On January the 15th, 1945, 2 SS officers arrived at the field hospital with orders signed by someone high enough in the Wehrmacht command that even Major Stewart couldn't ignore them. They were there for Klaus, for the traitor medic who'd been treating enemy soldiers, for the man who'd chosen the Hippocratic Oath over military duty. Stewart tried. "This man is a valuable medical asset. He's saved dozens of Allied soldiers. He's cooperating fully." The senior SS officer, a Hauptsturmführer with eyes like frozen steel and a face that had forgotten how to feel anything except duty, didn't even look at Stewart. "Dr. Brenner is wanted for court-martial in Germany. Charges of treason, dereliction of duty and giving aid to the enemy. He will be returned to Wehrmacht custody immediately." "He was captured by American forces," Stewart argued. "That makes him our prisoner." "German military law supersedes," the officer said flatly. "He will be extradited under Geneva Convention protocols for military justice. Unless you wish to create international incident." Klaus stood between them, silent, understanding exactly what was happening. The Wehrmacht wanted him back, not to reward him, not to acknowledge his medical skill, to make an example of him, to show other German soldiers what happened when you chose humanity over orders. "Major Stewart," Klaus said quietly, "is okay. I knew this would come." "The hell it's okay," Stewart snapped. "You've saved lives here. You've earned protection." "I save lives because it's the right thing to do," Klaus said. "Not because I expect protection. I make choice in Belgium. I live with consequences." The SS officer grabbed Klaus's arm, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to send a message. "You will come now." Klaus went, not because he wanted to, but because refusing meant the SS officers would make things worse for everyone at the field hospital, would find violations, would create problems, would turn Klaus's choice into something that hurt the people he'd been trying to help. As they led him away, Klaus looked back once, saw Major Stewart standing in the hospital tent entrance, saw the American soldiers he'd operated on, saw the medical staff who'd started treating him like a colleague instead of an enemy, and he saw something else. Sergeant Hayes, the man who'd captured him, the man who'd given him 5 minutes to save a British soldier's life, the man who was now watching Klaus being taken away with an expression that looked like guilt. Their eyes met. Klaus nodded once. A gesture that said, "Thank you for the time you gave me. It mattered." Hayes nodded back. A gesture that said, "I'm sorry I couldn't give you more." Then Klaus was gone, loaded into a truck with the SS officers, driven away from the field hospital where he'd found purpose, away from the work that had finally felt like medicine instead of war maintenance, toward a court-martial that would almost certainly end with a bullet. The trial happened in a bombed-out building in what remained of Wehrmacht headquarters in Germany, February 1945. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. But military justice still needed to be served. Military discipline still needed to be maintained. Military examples still needed to be made. Klaus stood before 3 officers who'd spent the war sending men to die and couldn't understand why one medic had chosen to save the enemy instead. The charges were read in crisp German that sounded like it came from a better Germany than the one that actually existed. Treason, dereliction of duty, giving aid to the enemy, conduct unbecoming an officer. Each one carried the death penalty. "How do you plead?" the presiding officer asked. Klaus looked at them. At these men who'd followed orders without question, who'd served a regime that had murdered millions, who were now judging him for saving lives instead of taking them. "Guilty," he said clearly, "to all charges." The courtroom stirred. His appointed defense attorney, a young lieutenant who'd been expecting Klaus to fight, to argue, to plead military necessity or temporary insanity, or any of the dozen excuses German soldiers used when accused of mercy, looked stricken. "But I am not guilty of being doctor," Klaus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I am not guilty of keeping my oath. I am not guilty of choosing to heal instead of harm. If Wehrmacht thinks these things are crimes, then Wehrmacht is criminal, not me." The presiding officer's face went red. "You dare to—" "I dare nothing," Klaus interrupted. "I state fact. I am doctor. I save lives. If this is treason, then I am traitor. But I am traitor to army that forgot what it means to be human. Not traitor to Germany, not traitor to medicine, not traitor to myself." Silence. Then the presiding officer spoke, his voice cold as February wind. "You will be executed at dawn tomorrow. May God have mercy on your soul." Klaus nodded. He'd expected nothing less. But something happened that night. Something nobody expected. Major Robert Stewart, U.S. Army Medical Corps, showed up at Wehrmacht headquarters with documents. Official documents. Red Cross documents. Documents that declared Dr. Klaus Brenner a protected medical asset under Geneva Convention, Article 19. Documents that said executing medical personnel who'd treated wounded was a war crime. Documents that changed everything. The Wehrmacht officers stared at the papers like they were written in a language they didn't speak, which, in a way, they were. The language of international law that said even in war, some things were sacred. "This is American interference," the presiding officer said. "This is international law," Stewart corrected. "Dr. Brenner treated Allied wounded under combat conditions. That makes him protected medical personnel. Executing him would be a war crime. And I guarantee you, when this war ends, and it will end very soon, every officer involved in his execution will face trial at Nuremberg." The threat hung in the air like smoke. These Wehrmacht officers knew the war was lost, knew the Allies were coming, knew that decisions made now would be judged later by victors who wouldn't care about following orders or military necessity or any of the excuses that had worked before. "You would go to this length," the presiding officer said slowly, "for a German prisoner." "I would go to any length," Stewart said, "for a doctor who saved my men when he could have let them die. That's what physicians do. We protect each other, even across enemy lines." The court-martial was suspended, officially for review of international law implications, unofficially because the Wehrmacht didn't want to create martyrs who'd be used against them at war crimes trials. Klaus was returned to Allied custody, not freed, not pardoned, but alive. Major Stewart met him at the truck. "You're going back to the field hospital," Stewart said, "under guard, still technically a prisoner, but alive." Klaus looked at him, this American major who'd risked international incident to save a German medic. "Why?" he asked. "Why do this for me?" "Because you saved my men," Stuart said simply. Because the oath matters. Because if we let bureaucrats and generals decide who deserves to practice medicine based on which uniform they wear, then we've lost something more important than the war. Klaus went back to work, saved more lives, performed surgeries that pushed the boundaries of field medicine, trained American medics in techniques he'd learned from professors who'd fled Nazi Germany, and ended up teaching in medical schools where ideas mattered more than ideology. And when the war finally ended, when the guns went silent and the killing stopped and Europe began counting its dead and trying to remember how to live, Major Stuart kept his promise. He used Red Cross channels, military networks, connections that reached into the ruins of Hamburg, where a city had been bombed to rubble and survivors lived in basements and waited for something better to come. It took 4 months. 4 months of searching through displaced persons records and refugee lists and the endless catalogues of people trying to find family members who might not exist anymore. But on September the 12th, 1945, Major Stuart came to Klaus with news. "I found them," Stuart said, his voice catching. "Your wife and daughter, they're alive. They're in a refugee camp outside Hamburg. I can arrange transport." Klaus couldn't speak. Couldn't process that after 5 years, after a war that had destroyed everything, after he'd given up hope that he'd ever see them again, Anna and Sophie had survived, were alive, were waiting. "Thank you," he finally managed. "Thank you is not enough words for this, but is all I have." "It's enough," Stuart said. "Go home, Klaus. Go be a doctor in a world that needs healing more than it needs soldiers." Klaus went home, found Anna and Sophie in a refugee camp where they'd been waiting, hoping, believing he'd survived, even when the notices said he was missing, presumed dead. They rebuilt, not in Hamburg, which was too destroyed, too haunted, but in a small town in Bavaria where they needed a physician and didn't care that he'd worn Wehrmacht grey, where all that mattered was that he could set broken bones and deliver babies and fight pneumonia and all the normal things doctors do when there's no war to maintain. He practiced medicine for 35 years, trained young doctors, taught them that the oath mattered more than orders, that humanity superseded politics, that choosing to save a life was never wrong, even when regulations said it was. And once a year, every year until Klaus died in 1980, Major Robert Stuart sent him a letter. Just a few lines, always saying the same thing. "The men you saved are still alive. They have children now. Grandchildren. You gave them that. Thank you for remembering that medicine has no enemies. Only patients. RS." Klaus kept every letter. 35 of them, each one a reminder that the choice he'd made in that Belgian farmhouse, the choice to treat British soldiers when he should have run, the choice that nearly cost him his life, had mattered, had created ripples that went further than battlefield survival statistics, had proved that even in hell, doctors could choose to be doctors first and soldiers second. This is the story they don't teach you, the one that doesn't fit neatly into heroes and villains, the one that reminds us that even in the worst moments of human history, people chose the oath over the order, the patient over the flag, the life over the uniform. And sometimes that choice was the most dangerous, most courageous, most human thing anyone could do. If this story reminded you that history is more complex, more beautiful, and more heartbreaking than we usually admit, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tell me if your family has stories like this. Tell me what we've forgotten that deserves to be remembered. Because at WW2 Declassified, we don't just tell war stories, we tell human stories that happen to take place during war. And those are the ones that matter most. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And I'll see you in the next story.